After 30 years of working together, Richard stood up at my retirement party and revealed something that made me question my entire career and everything I thought I knew. The restaurant was perfect, one of those cozy places with warm lighting and cloth napkins that made everything feel special. My colleagues had chosen well for my retirement dinner. 30 years of my life had been spent in that office building downtown, and here I was, finally saying goodbye to it all. The champagne was flowing. People were laughing, sharing stories about our projects and late nights at the office. I felt this mix of excitement and melancholy that I guess everyone feels when they close a chapter this big. Richard sat across from me at the long table, looking distinguished as always in his navy suit. 3 decades we'd worked together, him as my boss, me as his dedicated employee. We'd been through everything together: budget cuts, office relocations, company mergers, the transition to digital everything. He'd been my constant, the one person I could count on to be there through all the changes. Sure, he was demanding and had high standards, but I always respected that about him. The evening was winding down when Richard suddenly stood up. The conversation died as everyone turned to look at him. He had this serious expression on his face that I'd seen before during our most challenging projects. My stomach did a little flip because I knew that look meant something important was coming. He cleared his throat and looked directly at me. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then he started speaking, and my world completely fell apart. Richard told everyone at that table that he had been sabotaging my career for years. Not just small things, major, life-altering sabotage. He said he'd been jealous of my natural talent from the very beginning, from the day I walked into that office as a young, eager employee. He confessed to blocking my promotions, telling me there wasn't room for advancement while secretly recommending other people for positions I should have gotten. He admitted to stealing my ideas and presenting them as his own to upper management, taking credit for work that had come from my brain and my late nights. The worst part was learning that he'd deliberately kept me in lower positions despite knowing I was capable of so much more. All those times I'd wondered why I wasn't moving up, why other people seemed to get opportunities that never came my way. It wasn't because I wasn't good enough. It was because Richard was actively working against me. I felt like I was going to be sick. The room was spinning, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. 30 years of my career, and it had all been built on lies. Every accomplishment I thought I'd earned, every small victory I'd celebrated, none of it was real. I'd been living in a fantasy world while my own boss systematically destroyed my potential. The silence at the table was deafening. I could see the shock and horror on my colleagues' faces as they processed what Richard had just revealed. Some of them looked angry, others just looked stunned. I couldn't even bring myself to look at him. I stared down at my plate, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd just confessed. But then something strange happened. Richard started smiling. Not a cruel smile or a satisfied smirk, a genuine warm smile that completely confused me. The energy in the room shifted, and I finally looked up at him, totally bewildered. That's when he dropped the real bombshell. Everything he'd just said was backwards, complete opposite of the truth. Date 1. I can't even describe the emotional whiplash I experienced in that moment. Richard explained that he'd actually been my secret champion for 3 entire decades. Every promotion I'd received, every opportunity that had come my way, every time my work got recognized by the higher-ups, Richard had been the one orchestrating it all behind the scenes. He told us about countless meetings where he'd fought for me, pushing my name forward for projects and positions even when I didn't know they existed. When I thought I was just getting lucky or that my work was naturally being noticed, Richard was actually in conference rooms advocating for me, making sure the right people saw my contributions. The strangest part was learning about all the times I'd felt frustrated with my career path, thinking I was stuck or not advancing fast enough. Richard revealed that he'd been carefully timing my promotions and opportunities, making sure I was truly ready for each step and that I wouldn't be set up to fail. He'd been protecting me from positions that would have been too much too soon, while simultaneously preparing me for better opportunities down the road. He shared specific examples that made my head spin. That big client presentation I'd been chosen for 5 years ago? Richard had specifically requested me for it, telling management that I was the only one who could handle it properly. The company-wide recognition I'd received for streamlining our processes? Richard had been the one who brought it to the attention of the executives, making sure I got full credit. But here's the part that really got to me. Richard explained that he'd done all of this in secret because he wanted me to feel like I'd earned everything on my own merit. He didn't want me to feel like I owed my success to his intervention or to question whether I was truly capable. He wanted me to have the confidence that comes from believing you've achieved everything through your own hard work and talent. The room was still silent, but now it was a different kind of silence. People were smiling, some were getting teary-eyed, and I could see my colleagues looking at me with this new understanding. Suddenly, so many things made sense. Richard's seemingly random questions about my career goals, his way of pushing me toward certain projects, his insistence that I attend specific conferences or training sessions, it had all been part of his long-term plan to help me succeed. I felt this overwhelming mix of emotions. Relief that my career hadn't been a lie, gratitude for having someone who believed in me so completely, and honestly, a little bit of confusion about how to process everything. 30 years of thinking I was navigating my career on my own, and it turned out I'd had this incredible mentor guiding me from behind the scenes. But the story doesn't end there. Richard had one more revelation that would change everything I thought I knew about our professional relationship. Update 2. Richard sat back down, and I thought he was finished with his revelations. The room was buzzing with quiet conversations as people processed what they'd just heard. I was still trying to wrap my mind around everything when Richard caught my eye and gave me a look that said he wasn't done yet. He stood up again, this time with a manila folder in his hands that I'd never seen before. My heart started racing because I couldn't imagine what else there could be. He opened the folder and pulled out what looked like a letter-thick, official-looking paper that seemed important. Richard explained that 6 months ago, he'd received an offer from a major consulting firm to head up their new division. It was a dream position, the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a lifetime. The salary was incredible, the benefits were amazing, and it would have been the perfect capstone to his own career. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. Richard had turned down the job. Not because he didn't want it, but because part of the position would have required him to relocate and bring his top employee with him. That employee was supposed to be me. The company had specifically requested me based on my reputation and track record. They'd heard about my work through industry connections and wanted both Richard and me to join their team. It would have been an enormous opportunity for both of us. Essentially a chance to start fresh with unlimited resources and support. Richard had been planning to tell me about the offer and discuss it with me, but then I'd announced my retirement. He realized that I was ready to close this chapter of my life and start something new on my own terms. So he made the decision to turn down the opportunity without ever telling me about it. But wait, it gets even more complicated. Richard revealed that he'd actually been in contact with the consulting firm for months, not about the job offer, but about something else entirely. He'd been secretly working with them to set up a freelance consulting opportunity specifically for me. He'd used his connections and his reputation to create a retirement package that wasn't really retirement at all. The folder contained contracts and proposals for consulting work that would let me work on my own schedule, choose my own projects, and earn more money than I'd ever made as a full-time employee. Richard had spent months crafting this opportunity, using his industry relationships to ensure I'd have steady, interesting work for as long as I wanted it. I was completely speechless. Here I'd been planning for a quiet retirement, maybe some travel and hobbies, and Richard had been secretly arranging for me to have the most flexible, lucrative phase of my career. The consulting firm was specifically interested in my expertise and experience, and they were willing to pay premium rates for my insights. But the most shocking part was still to come. Richard explained that his plan all along had been to semi-retire himself and work alongside me as a consulting partner. He'd been envisioning this as the next chapter for both of us, working together as equals. Finally, after 30 years of the traditional boss-employee relationship. The room was absolutely silent as everyone processed this information. I could see people looking back and forth between Richard and me, trying to understand the full scope of what he'd planned. Some of my colleagues looked amazed. Others looked almost emotional as they realized the depth of Richard's dedication to my success. I felt like I was in some kind of alternate reality. Everything I'd thought about my career, my retirement, my future, it was all completely different from what I'd imagined. Richard had been thinking several steps ahead, planning not just for my success in our current company, but for my success beyond it. The weight of his investment in me was almost overwhelming. 30 years of mentorship, advocacy, and now this incredible opportunity that he'd created from scratch. I couldn't help but wonder why he'd done all of this, what had motivated him to dedicate so much energy to my career path. That's when Richard shared the final piece of the puzzle, and it was something that explained everything and nothing at the same time. Final update. Richard looked around the room one more time, and I could see him taking a deep breath like he was preparing for something really difficult. He'd already revealed so much, but I could tell there was still something more he needed to say. He started talking about his own career, his own journey through the industry. Richard explained that when he'd first started out, 35 years ago, he'd had a mentor who'd done something similar for him. An older gentleman who'd quietly guided his career, opened doors, and created opportunities without ever taking credit for it. But here's where the story took another unexpected turn. Richard's mentor had died suddenly, right before Richard's big promotion to the position where he eventually became my boss. Richard never got the chance to thank him or even to fully understand how much his mentor had done for him until years later, when he found old correspondence and company records that revealed the full extent of his mentor's influence. Richard had spent years feeling guilty about not appreciating his mentor's efforts while he was alive. He'd made a promise to himself that if he ever had the opportunity, he would pay it forward. When I joined the company, something about my approach and dedication reminded him of his younger self. He decided that I would be the person he'd invest in the way his mentor had invested in him. But the real shock came when Richard pulled out one more document from his folder. It was a letter, not a business letter, but a personal one, written in careful handwriting that looked familiar but that I couldn't quite place. Richard explained that his mentor had left instructions with the company's legal department to give him a sealed letter 5 years after his death. When Richard had received it, he'd learned something that changed his entire perspective on mentorship and career guidance. The letter revealed that Richard's mentor had been part of a chain of mentorship that went back decades. His mentor had been guided by someone else who had been guided by someone before that. It was like a secret tradition of successful people quietly ensuring that the next generation would have the support and opportunities they needed to thrive. But here's the part that completely blew my mind. Richard's mentor had included specific instructions in his letter. He'd asked Richard to continue the tradition, but with a twist. Instead of just finding one person to mentor, Richard was supposed to identify someone who could eventually become a mentor themselves, someone who could carry on the tradition and expand it. Richard looked directly at me and explained that he'd been preparing me not just for my own success, but to become a mentor to others. All those projects where I'd been asked to train new employees, all those times he'd encouraged me to speak at conferences or lead workshops, it had been preparation for this larger role. The consulting opportunity he'd arranged wasn't just about my expertise in our industry. The consulting firm was specifically interested in developing a mentorship program for their clients, and they wanted me to lead it. Richard had been setting up a situation where I could take everything I'd learned over 30 years and use it to guide other people's careers. I realized that this whole retirement dinner, this whole revelation, had been Richard's way of passing the torch. He was officially ending his role as my mentor and challenging me to become a mentor myself. The consulting work would give me the platform and the resources to help other people the way he'd helped me. The room was completely quiet as everyone absorbed this final piece of the story. I could see people looking at me with this new understanding of what my retirement actually meant. It wasn't an ending at all. It was a transformation from someone who'd been guided to someone who would guide others. I felt this incredible mix of emotions. Gratitude for everything Richard had done, excitement about this new opportunity, and honestly, a little bit of fear about living up to the legacy he'd created. The idea that I could have the same kind of positive impact on someone else's career that he'd had on mine was both thrilling and terrifying. Richard sat down for the final time that evening, and the room erupted in applause. But it wasn't just applause for his speech or his revelations. It was applause for 30 years of the kind of leadership and mentorship that most people never experience. My colleagues were celebrating Richard, but they were also celebrating the idea that this kind of dedication and investment in other people's success was possible. As the evening wound down and people started saying their goodbyes, I couldn't help but think about how completely different my life looked now compared to when I'd walked into that restaurant. I thought I was closing a chapter and starting a peaceful retirement. Instead, I was beginning what might turn out to be the most meaningful phase of my entire career. The consulting contracts were already in place. Richard had introduced me to key people at the firm, and I had a clear path forward that would let me work on my own terms while helping other people achieve their professional goals. It was like Richard had given me the perfect retirement gift, not rest, but purpose. Walking out of that restaurant, I realized that Richard's mentorship had been the most valuable thing I'd ever received. Not just the career advancement or the opportunities, but the model of how to invest in other people's success. He'd shown me that true leadership isn't about your own achievements. It's about the achievements you make possible for others. The tradition would continue, and I'd be the one carrying it forward. After 30 years of being guided, I was finally ready to become a guide myself.